give gratitude. And the gratitude that I'm giving is to Fairfield House to uphold this lovely building, and not only the building, but the name of Emperor Selassie, and also to exalt Ethiopia. Well, that's what we're doing here today, right? And I would just like to give the highest of gratitude to everyone. I don't know everyone by name, but I would just like to give gratitude to everyone who is involved in keeping the Emperor Haile Selassie legacy and Fairfield House alive and keep on going, because places like this need to be upheld, right? And there could be a lot of negative in life, but we choose to do the thing that is positive to uphold. My legacy, or the Emperor legacy then, is I who standing here talking now.
Gotcha.
You know, growing up as a child, when I was going to school, they said, what you want to be? I said, I want to be a Rasta man. You know, that was my ambition. And I've been treading this trad since 1991. I guess was long before that, you know, but, you know, when I found myself. And if it wasn't for Rastafari, even if I have 100 life, I wouldn't be alive today. So Rastafari definitely saved me. It gave me dignity, it gave me courage, it gave me great understanding, it gave me humanity, it gave me how to survive. You know, I'm a herbalist, I've been doing that forever since, and all of that was through the way of life of Rastafari. So again, we just want to say gratitude in abundance to Fairfield House. Thank you.
Unfortunately, we have another due today. Planned a long time ago. That's where they all are. Otherwise, a few Ethiopians would have come to see you all. My background is this, as I keep saying, paying this board by it. 5-6 generations of my family were associated with the emperors of Ethiopia, in good time and bad. During peacetime, they were governors in different parts of the empire. Bad times when we were invaded, first by the British, our good friends, during the reign of Emperor Tewodros, and then during the reign of Emperor Menelik, when we were invaded by the Italians. In between, we had civil wars, and all my family had participated in all those activities. My grandfather was killed at the Battle of Adwa. My father was wounded, captured, and taken to Italy. We don't hold any grudges, but what I wanted to say is, all the people from the Caribbean, they never forget the emperor. They always remember him, they revere him, and really, for me, it's very special, very personal. I can only say thank you very much. He also loved the Caribbean people very much. My dad told me so it must be true. During the war with the Italians, a lot of Caribbean people wanted to volunteer. They found it difficult to get to Ethiopia, but they contributed money. 1 or 2 highly skilled, I think at least one is it a pilot who participated. So I'll cut short my speech. I'll say just thank you very much on behalf of the Ethiopian community. Thank you.
We have a tribute from Scotland. Give thanks, Lanchivar. Yeah, I'll just share the testimony of how I came to Rastafari and the situation in Scotland and Fairfield House. Down here, this part of England, there's obviously a much larger, we were mentioning the Windrush earlier, there's a much larger West Indian community down here at this part of England, whereas in Scotland, not many people from the Caribbean live there. So when I was about 15, 16 years old, I was listening to reggae music, and some of my friends around me were starting to grow locks, they were starting to read the Bible, find out about Rastafari. But there were no elders, no community, no guidance around us. So at 17, a brethren and myself went out to Jamaica and stayed there for 3 months in St. Thomas to immerse ourselves and learn about the culture and take it home and apply it in our lives. So we've studied the native language of Scotland, Gaelic, and about our own Scottish roots and culture. And if you dig far enough back in the manuscripts and history, everything goes back to Ethiopia originally. So later on in life, through Rastafari, I found the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. I was baptized by Kisse Sabata, who was here earlier in Glasgow, Scotland, with my son, and given the name Gebre Jesus. And the week before I was baptized, I made my first pilgrimage here to Fairfield House, and it was a very powerful spiritual experience. The community here, everything, there's an energy here. I think it's a very true pilgrimage that when you travel and come somewhere like this, you take a little piece of it home with you. You get a little bit of fat, a little bit of oil for the lamp, to take home. And that phrase, iron sharpens iron, really rings true. So inspired by the works we've seen here, we've started a small group called Rastafari Scotland, where we document newspaper articles from Scotland about the Emperor and his visit in Scotland, his relationship with Scotland. He sent many of his grandchildren to Scotland to study. His father, Ras McConan, also visited Scotland in 1902 when he was here for the King's coronation. So we're hoping there's ones and ones spread out all over Scotland. We're trying to organise and centralise as much as we can and keep the Emperor's legacy alive in that part of Britain. So we're very inspired by everything we see here, and it's been wonderful. So we give thanks, and God bless Xavier Muscan, Rastafari.
Is the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities Leagues. Greetings, brothers and sisters.
Yeah.
Of course, the UNIA was founded for us as Jamaicans, our first national hero, the Right Excellent Marcus Mosiah Garvey, and it was founded in the year 1914. So we celebrate this year just on Sunday, tomorrow, the 20th of July, our 111th anniversary. But this year, 2025, also marks the 125th anniversary of the first Pan-African conference that was held. In fact, it was here in the city of London, here in UK, in the city of London, that the word Pan-African was introduced to the English lexicon 125 years ago on Wednesday. Wednesday also happens to be the Earth Strong of His Imperial Majesty Emperor Haile Selassie I. The first Pan-African conference took place in London over 3 days in 1900, beginning on July 23rd and continuing on July 24th and 25th. And I bring that up because, as Benji said, I'm here to speak about the legacy of the Emperor in the context of Pan-Africanism. But before I get into that, it's important that we understand what Pan-Africanism is and how Pan-Africanism is defined and how it has evolved over the centuries. Even though the first Pan-African conference was only held in 1900, and I say only because that's 125 years ago, Pan-Africanism really was born out of the resistance of Africans to what is usually referred to as the transatlantic slave trade, or really should be properly referred to as the European slave trade. To understand the social dynamics of Africa before the commercialization and creation of chattel slavery, we have to appreciate the fact that we did not have a concept, a unifying concept of being Africans before we were brutally assaulted, trafficked, and enslaved. When Europe arrived on the continent of Africa, starting with the Portuguese, coincidentally, who their first 2 points of contacts were with Ethiopia and what was then known as the Empire of Congo, or the Kingdom of Congo, which is in modern day Angola. Before that interaction, we really identified based on our tribal history. So there wasn't a concept of being black people or of being Africans. We were either Amhara or Oromo, or we were Swana, Bantu, Igbo, Yoruba, Ashanti. The concept of Africans, which is at the base of it really, what is the foundation of what we're speaking about today, Pan-Africanism, began on those slave ships. When Europe entered Africa, they encountered slave markets. And that's often a part of the myth that is perpetuated that Africans sold each other. The truth is, slavery for us was a part of our penal system. Africans did not build prisons in which we placed criminals. If you committed a crime, if you were a prisoner of war, you were sent to a slave market to be sold. Yeah. That achieved two things. One, compensation for whatever crime you had committed. And two, it expelled you from the tribe. Meaning if your crime was that serious that we did not want to tolerate or have you around us anymore, it removed you from within our society. Then you would serve your penance within the tribe that purchased you. For a period, you served your penance well, you didn't commit any other crimes, you were then absorbed into becoming a member of that tribe. And the children, if you happen to have children during that period, were not born into slavery, but were born as free members of that tribe. That was a concept of slavery within Africa. That was a concept of slavery in Ethiopia, even up until 1923, when Emperor Haile Selassie, who was the emperor to abolish slavery in Ethiopia. Now, because we have a misconception of slavery in the West because of the diabolical creation of what is properly referred to as chattel slavery, we often use those terms interchangeable. And it's the reason why the emperor came under pressure to abolish slavery in Ethiopia in order for Ethiopia to be admitted into the League of Nations in 1923, because that concept of slavery had been so tainted by the European slave trade and by the commercialization and creation of chattel slavery. That's the first thing we need to understand. But Africans resisted this from the very beginning. And it was in the resistance to chattel slavery that the concept of Pan-Africanism was born, even though we did not give it that name on the slave ships. When Europe first engaged with the slave markets in Africa, they were purchasing either criminals or prisoners of war. These were very deadly people, militarily. And so you find that the first communities of enslaved Africans in the Americas were not easy to control. I heard reference to the Maroons earlier. That word maroon comes from the Spanish term cimarron, which means wild, untamed, uncontrollable. Slavery began as a commercial enterprise began in the early 1500s. The first recorded slave, quote unquote slave, we don't like that term, but the first recorded uprising of Africans against the plantation system was in 1522 on the plantation of the nephew of Christopher Columbus, whose name was Don Diego Colon. He had a plantation in Hispaniola, or what we know today as the Dominican Republic, next door to Haiti. The first recorded uprising, 1522. So it goes to show you that Europe had a hard time maintaining the plantation system and the chattel slavery system from the very beginning, because the Africans who they were subjecting to that system were people trained in military tactics. So what they did, and this is recorded by a letter from the king of the Congo Empire, Alfonso I, to the king of Portugal, who wrote in 1526 that the European slave traders you are sending are violating the treaties under which slaves were to be bought and traded from Africa, and that they were no longer purchasing slaves from the slave market, but were kidnapping even women and children. And that his own relatives, the king's relatives, some of them had gone missing. 1526. So because the European system realized that we can't bring legitimate slaves, legitimate people from the slave markets, because these are either soldiers or they're notorious criminals. These are people who are not afraid to kill, who have experience in killing. We need to bring Africans who are more controllable. Hence, they began to violate those treaties, and they went even further to exploit the differences between tribes within the continent with the sale of ammunition and arms to foment wars between tribes in order that they could run raids into different territories, kidnapping women, children, civilians. They further compounded that in the system of transportation of Africans into the New World, their quote-unquote New World, because there was nothing new about it when they got here, people were here, to make sure that no slave ship was overloaded with a majority of a single tribe. Meaning you cannot put 400 Ashanti people on a slave ship. You got to put Ashanti, you got to put Wolof, you got to put Igbo, you got to put, so that they could exploit the differences in language and limit the ability of these Africans to communicate with one another while they were in that position. So these are the circumstances and the situations under which Pan-Africanism was birthed. And Pan-Africanism essentially is the concept that as Africans, we now look beyond our own tribal demarcations. So once we enter the belly of that slaver, it doesn't matter if the person beside me is Ashanti as I am, or they're Wolof, or they're Igbo. Within this slave ship now, we all become Africans, and we have a common enemy. And our survival on that ship is proportionally connected to our ability to unify and to act as one people. So essentially, Pan-Africanism is a philosophy of resistance. It is a philosophy designed and created for the survival of the African when confronted with the horrors of the system of chattel slavery that Europe perpetuated for over 3 centuries. It is a means of resistance and a means of survival. So in places like Ecuador, you had people like Macandal in Haiti. Again, testimony to the fact that Pan-Africanism is as old as the war that was perpetuated against Africans to enslave them and the creation and commercialization of chattel slavery. So we move from the maroon communities that were created as early as the 16th century, and then we come up now to the 18th century. Again, a story that is of particular significance to the fact that we are in the UK right now. In the 1770s, there was a group that came about that extended the concept of Pan-Africanism as a resistance to slavery when they resisted not physically like the Maroon communities, but they lobbied and convinced the British Parliament to end the slave trade in 1807. And the fact that most of you might have been educated in the British school system, I'm assuming you've heard the names Oluwado Equiano or Otoba Kogwano. In the 1770s, a group of formerly enslaved Africans who were living in London formed themselves into an organization which they named the Sons of Africa. The Sons of Africa was the group that brought to the attention of people like Granville Sharp, William Pitt, and other young members of the British Parliament the issue of the Zong massacre. And it became a springboard for what was then termed the abolitionist movement. And a lot of times the history teaches us about these famous MPs who quote unquote ended slavery, but nothing could be further than the truth. This was an action of Africans who had experienced slavery, lived through it, survived it, liberated themselves or attained their freedom, and were so concerned about their brothers and sisters who were still being enslaved that through their own wits and through their own political machinations were able to influence British MPs to bring about the end of the chattel system slave trade in 1807. Not the institution of it, which continued for almost 3 decades. And they're very rarely written about in the history books one time. I think it's only now that there's an effort to decolonize education, even in the Caribbean, and to reclaim the truth of the narrative of Africa and Africans' roles in resisting chattel slavery and bringing it to an end, to the creation of what we know today as Rastafari, which culminated with the coronation of His Imperial Majesty Emperor Haile Selassie I in 1930. Right? The Sons of Africa fought, got the British Parliament to end the slave trade, but they also got the British to establish Sierra Leone as a colony in Africa for the return of enslaved Africans who were being illegally trafficked after the trade was officially ended. The British Navy would intercept ships, and if they were not far from Africa, they would bring these Africans and leave them in Sierra Leone. If they were too far from Africa, they would bring them to places like St. Thomas in Jamaica and leave them there. Not a very thorough way of making sure that people got back home, but it was a way of sort of preventing them from ending up within the plantation system. And this is an important concept to understand within the context of Pan-Africanism, because it is the first time that the consideration of something known as repatriation comes about. This is in the 1790s. In fact, in 1792, Oluwado Equiano was made a commissioner for the colony of Sierra Leone for the purpose of overseeing the repatriation of Africans back to the continent. And within the 20th century, the Rastafari must be credited for being one of the loudest voices to continue to call for the act of repatriation of Africans to the continent of Africa. All of that falls within the philosophy of Pan-Africanism. So it moves from being just a philosophy of resistance to a philosophy of repatriation, to a philosophy of reparations. Essentially, it is based on 2 premises. One, self-reliance, of which Marcus Garvey was an ardent champion. And the second, the principle of collective security, who no other person on earth has spoken more eloquently to or about than the Emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie I. 2 concepts, self-reliance and collective security. This is Pan-Africanism. It's a philosophy driven by the thought that African descendants, wherever they are in the globe, are connected through a shared past, through a shared history, and that their prosperity moving into the future, right, is dependent solely on their unification, socially, politically, economically, and otherwise. In the 1880s, so we jump from 1790 now to the 1880s, still the word Pan-Africanism was not verbalized yet. But the philosophy of it, the essence of it, was alive and evolving. In 1880, some Anglican and Methodist priests in South Africa, native priests, so we're talking about Africans now who had been Christianized, began to challenge the Church of England and the Methodist Church about the fact that even though they were being accepted into the church, they were not being allowed to rise to the highest position of bishops and archbishops. And particularly, one of the priests by the name of Mapone decided to break away from these European churches and form what was known as a native African church. And it was predicated on the fact that they studied the Bible for several months, maybe even years, to challenge the Christian churches at that time, who secretly and openly in some cases perpetuated and upheld this concept of white supremacy. Let's not forget that the Catholic Church, the Pope himself, had issued a papal bull empowering the European slavers to go into Africa and enslave Africans. Let's not forget that if you've ever been to Ghana to visit the slave forts, that above the dungeons that our ancestors were kept in before they were transported to the West, above those dungeons was what? Churches. And above those churches were European governors of forts who, in the act of selecting soon-to-be enslaved African girls to rape, would have them come up from the dungeons, walk past the church to face the horrors that awaited them above that. So we had priests in South Africa in the 1880s who began to challenge this subliminal and subconscious acts and thoughts of white supremacy that existed even within the Christian church. Broke away, formed the native African churches, predicated on reading the Bible and challenging these European churches to biblically justify the enslavement and the oppression of black people and the concept of white supremacy. Remember, they had tried that during slavery, that's where we come up with concepts like Noah's son named Ham was an African, and that because Ham saw his father naked, his people were forever cursed to be servants and slaves. Well, these African priests countered that with other passages from the Bible. Key among them was Psalm 68 verses 31 that later became and still is the ritual of the UNIA, and that's a verse that says, "Princes shall come out of Egypt, and Ethiopia shall stretch forth her hands unto Jah," or unto God. This was the formation of seeds that Leonard Howell would later refer to in a counteraction to white supremacy as black supremacy. The Nyabingi House of Rastafari is still known to use that term, even though it is not politically correct anymore. But we must never forget that Rastafari is born out of the Pan-African experience. It is a black power creation before there was even black power, right? And it is an injection of black supremacy, not to overpower others, but as an inoculation against the prevalent dominance of white supremacy that still exists in the world today. Not so them inoculate you. Them have to take a little piece of the disease and inject you so that your body learn how to not only tolerate, but to fight it. And therefore you become immune to it. And this is why Rastafari is perhaps one of the most powerful manifestations of Pan-Africanism that still exists today. Aye? These priests created a concept which was then termed Ethiopianism, and it affected writers such as Edward Wilmot Blyden himself, the descendant of an enslaved African who repatriated to Sierra Leone. You see the connections now. And who in his writings began to create and to articulate this philosophy which was termed Ethiopianism, because it was based on this biblical passage that Ethiopia shall stretch forth her hands unto. In 1892, Italy began to prepare themselves for an invasion, but more so in 1892, a young prince was born in Ethiopia, Taras Makon and Walden Mikael, and Wazerio Yashimabet. They gave him the name Tafarai, which means to be feared. 4 years later, Italy invaded Ethiopia for the first time, but were soundly defeated by the emperor at the time, Emperor Menelik II, and his empress, Taitu Betul, who herself even commanded 6,000 soldiers and herself was a hero or heroine at the Battle of Adwa. The Battle of Adwa further empowered Ethiopianists at the time. Remember, we are creating this concept from 1880 as to say that black people are not inferior, that a Pan-African philosophy must not only unify us, but must educate us and empower us to our true history as a people and speak to our great accomplishments in a counteraction to the white supremacy propaganda that said Africans were closer to being monkeys than Europeans were. The reason why a papal bull was issued to say that they are less civilized than us, therefore we empower you to enslave them as a necessary step towards their civilization. We, the people who built the pyramids, we, the people who invented reading and writing, we, the people who knew what Pythagoras' theorem was when it was Imhotep's theorem before the Greeks stole it and gave it their own name. Facts? Princes shall come out of Egypt. And who shall stretch forth their hands unto God? This is Pan-Africanism. This is the root of Pan-Africanism. This is the foundation of Pan-Africanism. When
places where I don't supposed to be. And she exiled me to Bath. When I come to Bath, I remember the emperor was somewhere in the city. So I questioned and questioned. Someone said, yes, they know where the house is. So I said, not house, it's a palace. He said, no, he was living in a house at Newbridge Hill. So I said, okay. Meet me on Sunday evening, let me go to the pub. And I said, okay. Walk up to the pub, get to the pub called Langacre Pub. And while walking to the pub, there's a spirit eventually take me, walk me past the pub. Eventually, I wind up at this corner of the house. And the person said to me, this is the emperor's dwelling quarters. And I looked to heaven. And I said, Jah, Rastafari, you take me to your home and my home. And from ever since 1967, I've been around this house, securing, looking at the house, until the day when the council decide they're gonna sell the house. And a woman seen this thing in the paper and come to me at the Long Acre on the London Road where we run a calf. And the calf was there for the young people and, well, elders and the young peoples, and we start planning from there. And this woman come to me and said, "Oh, you seen this?" I said, "What?" She said, "In the paper, the emperor's house is for sale." I said, "They can't sell that, that's not for sale." And she said, "Where is Ross Bandela living?" I said, "In Bristol." And she said, "Where about in Bristol?" And I give her the address, and she jumped into her car, and she went straight over to St. Paul's in Bristol. 3 days after that, I got a phone call. Ross Bandela said, "Why, boy, I have to go meet the council, you know." I said, "Oh, yeah, I got council, we got to." Him said, "Boy, they must sell the house, you know." I said, "What house?" Him said, "The one at Fairfield, where the emperor left with the people there." So I said, "No, man, the council can't do that." So we planned and planned and planned and planned. We meet the council and set meeting with the council. And from there on, we start have a meeting with the council, and we fulfill the council with 13 members. I was the only one in Bath at the time. The other rest is from Bristol. And one of the members is standing here at the present moment. His name is Gad. And we fight and fight and fight and fight and fight, go to the council, till the council decided, they said, "Oh yeah, we come to a decision." And